Emoji is the message, a call for unity. Emoji is the message, a call for unity.
For a long, long time, we've been deceived by the illusion. We're called by different names, and this has served to just confuse us. When all is said and done, to be one's our revolution. We never stand alone, 'cause unity's our resolution.
Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. And I've thought a lot about the title of this show because I want to cover so much. And I first started out with framing opioid addiction. Then I thought, well, you need to reframe opioid addiction. So then I thought, oh, maybe we should frame and then reframe opioid addiction. But mainly my goal is to take it from the streets. That is to say, my goal is to change the face to some extent of opioid addiction from thinking that it is just ne'er-do-wells who are out in the street doing illegal drugs and getting themselves into trouble and causing great strife in the community. So I thought that if I had the right people, we could have that conversation, and I invited Dr. Joseph Day, who is a program coordinator for the Community Wellness Program at Governor State University, as well as an assistant professor. Hello.
Hi,
Nice to have you here.
and I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're glad. All right, and then I have Jamelia R. Hand. She's got a lot of initials. I have to look at my notes. She's MHS, which is Master of Health Sciences. Then she's a certified alcohol and drug counselor. And then she's MISAI, which I forgot as soon as she told me. But anyway, that just goes to show you that the people that I have on board today are very well versed in the subject matter. Now, Jamelia Hand is also CEO of Vantage Clinical Consulting. And so we want to talk about all those things. First of all, we want to talk to the guests and know who they are, what they do, and why they do it. And should we do ladies first?
I think that would
We'll
be
do
good.
ladies first.
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you so much for being here. This is an honor to serve my community and to serve your viewers. Again, my name is Jamelia Hand. I'm CEO of Vantage Clinical Consulting. And what we do is provide technical support and training to healthcare organizations on opioid addiction topics. And I would have to say, back in 2014, about almost 2,000 people died of opiate overdose in Illinois. Almost half of those overdoses took place on the west side of Chicago, where we are now. This concerned me. I'd been in the business long enough to understand that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Thus, Vantage Clinical Consulting was born. And as a result, I want to do everything that I can to help teach, educate, support, train, guide, lead, whatever it takes to help us reduce the grief associated with opioid addiction and overdose in our communities.
All right, well, I'm going to treat that as your opening statement.
All right.
Because I'm going to take you back past, beyond 2014, because I know you've been at this a very long time, young lady.
Yes.
All right, and Professor Day.
Okay. So my background is in public health, and the reason I'm in the seat today probably has to do with a seat I was in maybe 10 years ago. I was a research coordinator at Children's Memorial Hospital, and Children's Memorial Hospital at that time was located in Lincoln Park. But at that time, I lived in Austin. And I remember coming to work, going home, coming to work. And what I noticed was that the kids in Austin, in my neighborhood, they looked like they had come from a bombed out area. Their eyes weren't smiley. They just felt different than the kids in Lincoln Park. And I was making a decent buck. I had a master's in psychology. I was connecting with drug companies, doing their research for them. But it didn't feel right. So I thought about it for a while, and I decided I wanted to work with populations. I went to school at UIC and got my PhD in community health. And I think that's why I'm here today. Part of community health, of course, is substance abuse. That was not or is not my focus per se. My focus is looking at kids who grow up in low-resourced urban communities and examining all the conditions that affect them, how it affects them developmentally, what happens to them in later life, and so on.
Very good opening statement, if I must say so. Now, let's get down to getting the subject matter in hand. This conversation has changed. You know, of course, I've been in the world a very long time, and when we first heard about drugs, that's what they were called. They were called drugs, they were called narcotics, they were called marijuana, they were called reefer, they were called a lot of names, but they were not called opioids. So now what is this opioid and why is it used in place of the names that people on the street recognize as the problem? People never say my brother or sister or mother has an opioid problem. So tell me something more about opioids so that my viewing audience can understand it.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking, what has changed? What has changed is that, in my opinion, it is no longer a black, brown, poor folk problem. It's a white, middle class, young folk problem. And I think the people who have constructed that reality are struggling with how do we frame this? So it's not those poor black folks out there doing drugs as they always do because that's what we expect them to do. Now it's Bill, who's a good kid except for the drugs that he uses. So I think that at least is partly responsible.
So we're cleaning up, we're sterilizing the concept of drug addiction by calling it opioid, so that when my son or daughter in the gated community where I live has this challenge, then I don't have to say my son or daughter is a drug addict.
No, exactly.
Okay, well, that's very good. So whose phone is that? Let's pretend like it's not mine. All right. I did put it on automatic pilot or something, airplane mode. It shouldn't be happening. But anyway, we're going to pretend like it's not happening and it'll go away. It will go away. All right, I want to ask a question. This is persistent, isn't it? I want to ask a question about the use of painkillers as perhaps a precursor to addiction. In other words, how do we get there? Not just, you know, we now know we're talking about a vocabulary that's manipulated so that it does different things for different populations. But now we need to know the roads that sometimes are taken to arrive at the point at which you have the opioid addiction or the drug or the substance abuse addiction. Tell me what roads lead us there?
Well, there are several roads that I think can lead one to, you know, use drugs and to become dependent or even addicted to drugs. Those have two totally separate definitions. If we look at dependence, you know, personally, I may take a medication every day that I require, whether it be, you know, a medication for diabetes or hypertension. And if I don't take those medications, of course, I have challenges as a result of that. And so that means my body is now dependent on the medication. Addiction, on the other hand, is, of course, continued use despite negative consequences, building up a tolerance to a drug, withdrawal symptoms, cravings, the things that make someone feel as though they need this in order to survive, thus resulting in, more often than not, bad behaviors. I think that's what we probably call them. So that's the first thing, defining the difference between dependence and addiction. Secondly, the road could start in any number of places. I'll share a personal situation with you. My father was dependent on opiates. He didn't start there. He was not a war veteran. He did not come home from the military with PTSD and needing to, suppress, bad experiences. He didn't start that way. He was a victim of a robbery and he was shot. And he had a bullet in his pancreas. He did not want it to be removed, so he did not have it removed, which left him in constant pain all the time. And so the result of that pain is requiring pain medication. So he took pain medication. He would do okay sometimes. Other times he didn't do okay. But the result, after long-term use of pain medication, he became dependent, and then at some point he became addicted. And that line is very fine. And the medical community has its job cut out for them to figure out where that line is. But in a nutshell, once he became addicted, the story went downhill. So that was his road. And I'm sure that happens more often than not.
Well, having met your father, I do know a little something about that. Mm-hmm. And I do realize that it was not just his decision not to have the bullet removed, mm-hmm. but it was in such a precarious position mm-hmm. that the risk was too great. Mm. And there was another member of the family who was part of the medical community who did not think that it was a good idea for him to take that risk.
Yes.
So sometimes, I'm saying that for clarity, I'm saying that because sometimes people find themselves in situations where it is not their decision mm-hmm. whether or not they are prescribed pain-killing drugs. Mm-hmm. And when the pain is severe, generally speaking, they tend to prescribe heavy-duty painkillers
yes.
that are known to be addictive. And thus, when a person is released from the hospital and the painkiller is no longer being prescribed, then nothing over the counter is going to compensate or is going to measure up to these heavy-duty painkillers that
yes.
they have. So I remember that he went in and out of the hospital many, many times during the course of a year because it would eventually become so excruciating that they had to put him in again and give him even more heavy duty, just painkillers on steroids, mm-hmm. so to speak. So once you get an injury or an illness that requires that you have addictive painkillers, then you are, as you pointing out, on the path to become what is called a substance abuser, because you're not doing it for pleasure, you're doing it to survive
yes.
the discomfort that you're experiencing. I wonder if we know anything about percentages of people who become opioid addicts as a result of prescription drugs. Are there any statistics out on that?
The last I'm familiar with, and I'm not sure if you have any numbers, but there were about 2 million people addicted to prescription pain medication mm-hmm. in 2014.
Right.
That
right.
number is rising as we sit here.
Right. So
I think, though, that the conditions, so we have the condition of somebody being in pain, we add to that mix some kind of pain killer, mm-hmm. but I think there's another piece that increases the probability that this person may become a substance abuser, meaning that whether once the pain subsides, they can gradually get off the pain medication. There seems to be some other factor that can lead a person down this path. And increasingly, I think what we're finding is that despair is the thing that can lead a person to, once the pain is no longer an issue, they continually use the drug to deal with the ennui, the boredom, whatever it is. And then that becomes their way of coping.
I can understand that. And you know, I had a friend once who lived in Africa, and she had an African friend who drank heavily. And so she challenged him about it. And he said, but how do you dry the tears? Mm-hmm. For him, it was anesthesia. Yeah. And so when you talk about pain of despair, there is psychic pain. There's pain of loss of loved ones. There is pain of being oppressed.
Yes.
There's pain of being alone.
Yes.
There's a pain of being deprived when you don't know how you're going to make it from one day to the next day. You may not call this actual physical pain, mm-hmm. but the discomfort and the stress and the dread that comes from living in communities that lack resources is very debilitating. Yes. And sometimes I think it may be a way of drying the tears.
Without a doubt. And it's no coincidence that when we look at the populations and the communities where we see the increases in substance abuse, they're usually communities with low resources. Not only us, African American, Black people, but think about the Appalachians. There is an awful lot of substance abuse there, a lot of poor people there, a lot of people who are dealing with despair.
Mm-hmm. So how do you live in the world when you are so grossly unhappy, when you're so grossly unfulfilled, when your life does not seem to have a purpose and every day is Groundhog Day? It doesn't change. You know, having something to look forward to, you know, having a raison d'etre. Why am I here? Yeah. You know, what am I going to do with my life? You know, what is there for me? What expectations can I have?
Wow. Well, for me, that question is overwhelming. It's extremely overwhelming. One of the things that I had to realize is that I don't have an answer, and that's okay. So the best thing that I could do is what I did, which was to become a counselor. And it was important for me to, I guess, be able to share two things with clients. The first thing was I get it. And the second thing is I believe you can get better. Those were the first two things that I said to any client before we had any conversation about anything else. Because as Dr. Day mentioned, we have to start somewhere, not in those words, but we just have to start somewhere. And that's where I usually start.
I understand people must have hope, mm-hmm. that things can be improved. People yes. must have hope that problems can be solved. And I don't want to put an emphasis on the despair, but what I do want us to put forward here is that more often than not, and that's my perspective, more often than not, when you see populations of people mm-hmm. all affected or having the same problem, then there's something in the society that has a hand in that it isn't just individual choice. And I sometimes see drugs as an instrument of social control, because when people are focused on how do I get the substance to keep myself, you know, from going off the deep end, when they're focused on that, they certainly can't be focused on love thy neighbor, do good in my community, improve conditions, take care of the children. You can't have those goals when you're focused on just where will I get the money to be able to keep this thing going, keep myself alive. Because my understanding is that when people are not able to get the substances to which they are addicted, that they become physically ill. Is that true?
Yes, very, very much so. I am grateful to say I don't know what it feels like, but I've been a witness on many occasions. And from least severe to unbearable, you have, restless legs, watery eyes, runny nose, and then more severely, joint pain, back pain, nausea, vomiting. It's like I've heard it's a really bad flu times 13. And the only thing you want to do is to feel better. And so I would think that if I have to suffer that and go through that, my only thought is, how do I get better?
Right.
That's my goal.
Right. And that just seems so logical, that once you went through the withdrawal, that, I say that I used to be a smoker, not a really heavy smoker, but I did smoke. And I wanted not to smoke, but I also consumed beer, and they were companions. When I figured out finally that they were twins, that I couldn't give up the one without giving up the other one, then I realized I had to not just stop smoking, but I had to stop that alcohol from getting in there too. So when I was able to do that, I said, when God opens up a door, go through it and don't look back. And once you get on the other side, the relief that you feel makes you want to stay on the other side. And I have great compassion for those people who force that door open and go back in there, because I think it may be harder if you try to do it a second time. But as you say, your goal is to help people to get better, to have them understand that you understand what they're going through. And in so doing, if you help people get better, they can live more productive lives.
Hopefully.
And yes, and I'm sure that you have run into people with substance abuse problems who have been able to transcend them and who are now contributing to the well-being of the community. You want to tell about some cases?
Oh, sure. It's kind of an unspoken fact, and these are people outside the field. They don't know that most people who work in the field are in recovery themselves. So if I work at an agency that has 200 employees, a substance abuse treatment agency, I can assume that most of my colleagues have gone through some form of a program. They have arrived at recovery, and they're doing so well that they help other people. One personal story that I can consider, and Dr. Day and I were speaking about this earlier, I had a client who had gone through a 1.5-year program, and he was a very difficult client initially. But after 9 months, he successfully graduated the program, and he was working as a barber at the time. I think to date, he owns his own barbershop, and he's doing very well and employing people in the community. So that's just one of many, many success stories that I'm happy to report. But we don't often get to see that in our everyday. We get to see how drugs have negatively impacted our communities.
My sister died in her addiction. So in my family, my father's alcoholism was the conditions that led to a lot of chaos in our household. And my sister succumbed, used drugs, did things she shouldn't have did. Eventually, she contracted AIDS. And I can remember going to the hospital, and the doctors hadn't told her that she had AIDS. They said that she had a stomach tumor. But I got to talking with them, and I said, isn't that one of the things that happens when a person contracts AIDS? And he finally told me, and I said, you guys aren't going to tell her she has AIDS? So I went and told her. And she couldn't believe it. She could not believe that she was going to die. So we brought her home, and we had hospice. And I can remember she was laying in this bed in the basement, and the hospice nurse was there. And she said, you should hug your sister. And for a long time, she and I hadn't talked because she was doing all these crazy things. But eventually, I got over my craziness and was able to reach out to her. One day, she asked me to go get her watermelon. This was in the wintertime. So I'm running cross country to get her a watermelon. When I got back, she was dead. But we made peace. Yeah.
You know, when there's any problem at all, in particular the problem that the examples you just gave, it's in the family.
Of course.
It's not just the individual. It's in the family. Sometimes other members of the family take up the same thing. Other times, other members of the family learn from the example of what not to do. In either case, the family is impacted by the presence of opioids in the community.
Exactly.
Now, you're dealing with community wellness. Tell me about that work at Governor State University.
Well, again, my focus is on, and this goes hand in hand with it, trauma. And what I've noticed and what the research seems to indicate is that all the conditions that create whole communities of people using substance abuse are also related to the amount of trauma in the community. As you correctly pointed out, poverty is traumatizing. I have a PhD, and I walk into a store and I get followed. That's traumatizing. So all of these little things are traumatizing, which, if we start with the kid, affects the development of their brain. And so we have many kids in our communities walking around with, and I don't want to make this sound too bad, but maladapted brains. And it starts at a very early age. Then they go to schools that cannot provide the support, the diagnosis, or anything they need to help them overcome it because it's not considered a problem. Because most of the other kids are behaving like them. So we have these kids who may act out. Why are they acting out? Possibly because they're dealing with some traumatic event that's happened in the home, as you pointed out, and this is their way of coping with it. But the schools, of course, don't have the resources, and many of them don't have the mentality to understand this is what's going on. So they come up with these zero tolerance rules, meaning that these kids get kicked out. Where are they going to go? To the corner. What are they going to do in the corner? Expose themselves to drugs or violence, and
Antisocial behavior.
the cycle just continues. So trauma, substance abuse tend to go hand in hand. And some communities have it at huge, incredible levels. A place like Austin, where my mother lives and where I will be going once I leave here. I see it in the kids' eyes. It's there, it's present. The schools are ill-equipped. Many of the parents are ill-informed. When you go to a store and you hear a mom calling her kid a blank, 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 that's traumatizing. So.
You know, there's a concept, post-traumatic PTSD, stress disorder.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Take the post away from that.
Yeah, exactly.
There is nothing post
About
about
it.
something that happens every day of
Exactly.
your life.
Exactly.
It is a present traumatic stress disorder. And I have an example to go with yours. When I was teaching elementary school, I had a student who was normally a very well-behaved student. This particular day, I said something to him. He turned over a chair and, almost his desk. He just had this explosion. And of course, the general rule is the child disrupts the class, you send the child to the principal, and the principal either talks to him and returns him to class or sends for the parent. Well, the child never returned to my class. At the end of the day, when I spoke to the principal said, "Don't worry about him. They'll be moving soon. They came here from the South, and the father hasn't been able to find a job, and the mother has cancer, and they haven't been in the state long enough to get welfare, so so they don't have any means of support. So they're not going to be in the school district for very much longer." Really? Don't give him another thought. He won't be a problem much longer because the family is going to have to move because they have no means of support.
Exactly.
Then I understood the child. The child was living with that every day.
Yes.
And he was in my classroom and I said something to him and he just blew up. It wasn't at me. It was he had all he could take. And the outburst was a result of that. This is why we need people like yourself. We need people who understand the social conditions surrounding people. So you can truly and genuinely say, "I get it,
Exactly.
but we can make this better." So when that child returned to my class the following day, then I grew closer to him. I didn't, go in and baby him, but I started treating him with greater concern, with greater civility, because I probably spoke to him in some kind of way that resounded as some kind of rejection. So I started being more careful in my communication, not only with that child, but with the other children. When you're training professionals, you need to get to classroom teachers because we are in contact with young people, and we don't know that removing a young man's hat from his head when he walks into the room, not asking him to please remove your hat, not even saying please, not treating people like people, leads to a lot more problems than we need to have. And we don't need to pour kerosene on the fire.
Exactly.
So what are you talking to these professionals about that you're providing consultation for? What are the kinds of things that come up?
Well, we talk about trauma, at least, but we also talk about re-trauma. We don't want to make the situation worse.
Right.
It's very important that we don't exacerbate whatever problems they're having at home.
Right.
When they're with us, and I'm not in direct clinical services anymore. I have not practiced in about 10 years now. But with the professionals, let's say we started with a school teacher. We have to understand their model of the world as well. We have to understand their perspective before we even start to have a conversation with them about the child, because we can't correct them until we can connect with them. So not only are they not given what they need, they don't always have the resources that they need to help them manage the children that are struggling in their class. But oftentimes their parents, if they're not getting parenting at home the way that they should. I've had elementary teachers tell me that they've brought food to school for children who came to school hungry, clothing. My best friend teaches, I believe it's 3rd grade. She bought a Christmas tree for a family. Now, I know that is not part of what she signed up to do, but it was important to her to be able to bring some normalcy to the household of that child that was struggling in her class as it related to Christmas. So she did what she had to do. But we can look at teachers the way we look at healthcare professionals. They have a certain amount of time to accomplish a task, period. If they have 15 minutes to teach this lesson, an hour to teach another lesson, we have to prepare for tests. When do we expect for them to be counselors?
Well, you know, I just love this interview more than anybody who could be watching it, because you're shedding light on things. I used to always think that teacher training institutions do not prepare teachers for the real world. You watch films of children, well, go to Dick and Jane. You probably never saw that first grade reader, that primary reader, where, you know, the father takes the children to school, or the children leave for school while the father's still home because he hasn't gone to his job yet, but he does have one.
Yes.
And he goes to his job, and the mother has on the apron and she makes the cookies, and the children come home from school and they play with the dog and the cat. This is not the world that most teachers have to practice their craft in. They come into situations where children are deprived, not only deprived of resources, but deprived of their own culture. They never see themselves in the textbooks. They don't see themselves. And when they do see themselves, say on a sitcom on TV, it's always in some role that mocks them and makes fun of them rather than elevates them and makes them think of themselves as at least as smart as Lassie. So you've got this situation where teachers are not prepared to teach the children who will actually be sitting in their classrooms. The second part of that is you have exactly what you described, the paucity of time. You have a situation where teachers are expected to be clerks. They're expected to grade papers, to fill out forms. There are always reports that are expected by the district. There's always something to do. And teachers who really want to teach have a struggle trying to find opportunities during the day to do exactly that and not have to sit at the desk and fill out a form or have a parent conference because, you know, there's been a discipline problem. So to sympathize with the professionals is a good thing because they have the problems associated with the bureaucracy. Then they live in families too. And so some of the same things that we're describing, teachers have in their homes, you know? So now here you have a situation where you have somebody who is not equipped as they should be, who is not given a real picture of the real world, but they are dedicated, and this is what they have decided to do, and they're devoting themselves to do. They need support.
They do.
Parents need to understand that teachers need the support. Teachers need to understand that parents need the support, and we need to understand the concept of community. We're all in this together.
Yes.
You know, a rising tide lifts all boats. If the tide isn't rising, what are the boats doing? So we have to care enough to explore these social conditions and do what we can. And you have to be Mother Teresa. You know, you have to be the Lone Ranger. You have to be that one person who just don't try to save the world, because you can't. You know, we heard about the Savior and we know it ain't you. So don't try to save the world, but there's a part that you can do. There's a role that you can play.
Yes.
And you have carved out your role. You've carved out your role. Now, what advice do you give to the lay person who is in their own home, the pastor who is in his church, you know, there are people who are in positions that they don't recognize they can use to apply to the solution of social problems. So What's your advice?
So, on occasion, when I do talk to teachers and lay people about these kinds of issues, one of the things I tell them to do is make sure that everybody in the family gets to celebrate their birthday. Have chicken, cake, and ice cream. Everybody gets the same thing. Nobody gets forgotten. Everybody gets the same thing. And you do it routinely. So everybody should have a birthday celebration, number one. Number two, one adult can make all the difference in the world in the life of a traumatized kid. Because trauma usually means the loss of trust. And we have to help the child reestablish trust. And having that one adult, and trust can simply be being consistent. That's what trust is about, being consistent. I used to do an experiment when I would have a pen and I would drop it. And I said, what's going to happen to that pen? I would ask my students, I said, it's going to fall. How do you know it's going to fall? Because it always falls. That's trust. So if you can develop a relationship with one kid in your neighborhood, in your household, or whomever, they know you're going to be there, they know what you're going to say, they know how you're going to be, you can maybe save that child's life.
That's consistency.
Exactly.
And what you really talked about in the beginning when you were saying have a birthday celebration, you're talking about kindness.
Yeah.
Just find a way to be kind to every single person you encounter.
Yeah.
Birthday, whatever you do, find a way to be kind. Your advice?
I would say, like the airplane ride, when you are given the instructions on what to do in case of an emergency,
Right.
and you put your mask on first.
Right.
More often than not, people feel like they can handle substance use in their homes. And I have yet to see anyone who's been able to do that successfully. But because of their shame or their guilt or their belief that someone outside of their home is going to think that they're not a good person, not a good parent, they wait far too long to enlist backup. And you really need paratroopers in your home to swarm. You really need a SWAT team sort of mentality to get a hold of it in your household. Because if you don't, that problem will
Escalate.
It'll escalate in a way where it's like a tornado, and it'll leave damage, devastation, everything else you can imagine in its wake. Because addiction is a family sport, and at some point everybody gets to play. No spectators are on the sideline. Everybody gets to play. So if you think fix her or fix him and our family will be okay, it's not going to happen. Everybody has to get the help that they need, and you can't do it alone. So put your mask on and go and get help.
Another aspect of this problem, again, because poverty is going to keep being part of this problem in this conversation. Not because there aren't wealthy people who have substance abuse problems, but they also have resources, and they can go to the country club, and they can get into rehab, and they can relapse, and they can go back there, and they can, rebuild their careers after they, have been publicly, and humiliated and disgraced. We don't have to talk about people who can resolve their problems because they have resources. We want to, in this conversation, we're talking about people who have few resources. In low resource communities, you have health issues that are not addressed, and there are problems called malnutrition. How do you get a healthy child out of convenience foods, out of junk foods, out of fast foods. The instances in which you survive that kind of lifestyle are fewer than the instances in which you don't. So you actually talked about the brain, maladapted brains. Brains are affected by nutrition.
Without a doubt.
Behavior is affected by nutrition. Your blood sugar goes up or down, your behavior changes. So there are things that we can point to that are just normal things that when you deprive children who are developing, adults may do a little better, but developing children need the support of nutrition. They need food, they need good food, they need good water.
Yes.
They need air that is not so full of pollution that the oxygen level is down to practically zero. So you also have unhealthy conditions, which leads to unhealthy children, which when you have a maladapted brain, how do you make good decisions?
Right.
How, when somebody suggests to you, you ought to try this, do you see some kind of rational explanation of why you shouldn't? So your judgment is impaired.
Yes.
And if that has gone on until you become parents yourself, then how do you raise your children?
You don't.
If you have maladapted neurology, then the bad judgment that comes as a result of that, not because you're dumb and unintelligent, but simply because you haven't got enough stuff going on in the gray matter, you know, then you in the store, how many syllables did you put in that name you calling that child? And that we have all had the experience where we have been embarrassed by the way that an adult has spoken to a child, you know, and wanted to wrest the child from that adult so that they couldn't repeat that behavior. But we're looking at the expression of oppression and poverty, which is kindred to oppression. You cannot have oppressed people without having all the things that we're discussing here today. So we're at this end, you know, we're at the product end.
Yes.
You know, the product has already been produced. It is in our midst, and we are trying now to do something to manipulate this product into something that can function. But there's at the other end is the producer. Somebody is producing these social problems for us to try to solve. And the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. We do not have enough people, boots on the ground,
Right.
who are dealing with this. And when you talk about put your own mask on first, that means that those of us who can must take a responsibility for equipping ourselves.
Absolutely.
And when I'm talking about equipping is not, I don't want to learn how to do what you know how to do, because you're good at that. I just want to learn how to know you're there. I want to learn how to know you're there. I want to learn where are the resources. Not if, when this problem shows up in my community, maybe in my household, I want to know where to turn. I know how to call the police. I know how to call the fire department. I don't know who to call for this, because they haven't told me the bureau, you know, they haven't given me my phone book doesn't have that in there. So I need to know that I can call a person such as yourself. I know I can come to Governor State University. You're associated with Governor State University too, aren't you?
Yes.
They do a lot in addiction studies and a lot of work. Is that true of the other state universities? Do they? I don't remember seeing that at Northeastern.
There isn't a whole
Yeah.
lot of addiction studies programs, not at the level. What makes, in my opinion, Governor State unique is what she said. Many of the people who come to learn about addiction studies are recovering addicts themselves.
Okay.
And they bring that personal perspective
Okay.
to their practice, to the university in and of
Okay.
itself. I don't know if any of the other universities have that perspective. I
Okay.
think that makes a difference.
Okay. So do you have a resource book, like a little manual? Because there's something called a community resource guide,
Right.
something called a neighborhood resource guide. Most people don't have those in their homes. So they don't really know who to call for any particular social problem that they may be facing. But people need to know before the problem arrives. You know, you have a fire extinguisher in your house. You never expect to have a fire. You hope to never have a fire. But you have a fire extinguisher so that if there should be a fire and there's something that you can control until the real paratroopers show up, that you will do something about it. Those of us who have the luxury of being able to identify resources need to make a list, or in some way you need to share where we go. Are there hotlines that you call? What's a mother to do?
I'll give you the good and the bad.
Okay.
As you may be aware, the state of Illinois does not currently have a budget. So we don't have a budget for this particular issue, and we haven't had one for 3 years. So treatment centers have closed, mental health clinics have closed, people have merged and partnered. What I am seeing a really strong evolution of are grassroots organizations, people in the community who have come together in love and grief in whatever capacity they can and pull their resources together and say, hey, this is what we need to do. We'll go out in the community, we'll talk to people free of charge, and we're willing to carry and distribute the opioid antidote. So that's like an EpiPen for opiate overdose. So they're talking to people, they're talking to families, they're training people in the communities so that they can be prepared to deal with this problem on the community level.
So the community is saving itself.
Yes.
It's pulling itself
Absolutely.
up by the absent bootstraps.
Yes, and it's beautiful.
It's wonderful.
It is.
Yeah, but the state not having a budget means that institutions and community centers can't have budgets, and so therefore they can't serve.
Well, I gave you the bad. I'll give you the good.
Okay.
Because opioid addiction in general is addiction has been recognized as a medical disease by the American Medical Association.
Okay.
Since then, we've started to see more of a medical approach toward its treatment. It's slow, but we're getting there.
Okay.
And so the result of that is us being able to provide medical style interventions in a variety of medical settings.
Okay.
So not only in the hospital, but in urgent care, in some retail clinics. You have CVS and Walgreens now carrying an opiate overdose medication that
How
they can
expensive
teach.
is that? I've heard stories.
Yes, there are some that are $4,000, and there are some that are $75. There are some that are $150. So what I would ask your viewers to do is to go and just call a local pharmacy. If they don't have it there, they can probably order it, and it'll be in a couple of days.
Well, you know, I'm glad that I'd said this was part one, because obviously there needs to be a part two, because $75 is a prohibitive amount of money, especially if it's often. But, you know, I do understand that you got to start somewhere and you got to do what you can do. You want to give a closing statement, Professor?
the problem is large. But I think it begins and ends, as you've correctly pointed out, with the family within the community. And no matter what those forces that are making it difficult for us to rise, we still control our destiny to a certain extent. And I think, at least from my perspective, one of the things that we can do is to help people feel good about themselves. Mm-hmm. Most substance abusers don't use drugs because they feel good about themselves. They're using drugs because they don't feel good, or they want to feel something different. Most people in prison aren't in prison because they feel good about themselves. They're in prison because they don't. So I think as parents, as friends, as neighbors, we need to figure out ways to help each other feel good about ourselves.
Well, thank you. And I want people to feel good about themselves, so I always recommend that people know their history.
I agree.
Because black people could really feel very wonderful about themselves if they knew their illustrious history before they were taken captive and brought to these shores. In fact, if they knew some of the things that you can learn when you explore your own history, they would probably have their chests way out. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and have a higher regard, a higher self-esteem. So all of these suggestions are helpful, and I've been so pleased. I love to hear the truth, you know, and I just love for people who are just sincere in their presentation of the truth, and not afraid, you know, unafraid to say what you see. And I'm greatly appreciating the fact that you have taken it upon yourself to do the work that you do. And I know that you didn't just start doing it when you got a master's, and you didn't just start doing it in 2014. I know that you had to, first of all, go to school a very long time to get to the point at which you could get somebody to let you in the door, mm-hmm. so that you can access the people who need your help. Because you need credentials to get to your community on a professional level. So you have done that work for us, and we appreciate you.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Hotep audience, I hope that you've enjoyed this show, and I hope that you will be watching again. I'll certainly be having these two people back. And the next time, I'm going to give them something more important to do than just sit around talking about opioid addiction. Because I know that they have a broader range, and we just scratched the surface. Did you want to make a final statement?
The best thing that I can leave you and your audience with is be prepared. Almost 20 million people are impacted by prescription opioids. It's a problem that is only going to get bigger. So go to the internet, look up opioid addiction, figure out what you can do in your household to prepare your family and your children. First and foremost, lock up those medications and just be prepared. It's not a matter of if, it's when.
And if you don't have the internet, just take a little trip over to Governor State University. I managed to get that in.
Let us share one mind through a vision of our future, while we're holding hands to form a circle around our motherland.